Welcome to the ARKHAM Sessions, everyone. As always, I'm Brian Ward, and I'm sitting next to Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hello.
So we're coming off the biggest week of the show ever.
It was.
Turns out Harvey Dent, pre-Two-Face, is a pretty interesting guy. But this week it's going to be pretty interesting as well. This is the very first episode where we're given Two-Face from beginning to end. If you thought the psychological war between Harvey and Big Bad Harv was over, now that Dent's been disfigured, well... so let's get started, shall we?
We shall.
Okay, so last week, Harvey was struggling with his alter ego, Big Bad Harv. His therapist thought that this persona was created by Harvey's suppression of every angry feeling he's ever had since he was a kid. And it was somewhat determined by those within the show that due to his inability to remember his time as Big Bad Harv, Harvey was suffering from multiple personality disorder, or as it's called now, dissociative identity disorder.
Right, DID.
Andrea, you thought there was an alternative diagnosis, though, something about horses and minotaurs.
Right. Well, I use the phrase that we often use in this field, which is when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. And it's not to say that zebras don't exist. They certainly do, but sometimes when we hear certain characteristics and symptoms, we immediately go to the most kind of interesting, exotic representation, and we forget about what might be the most common and certainly well-explained scenario or diagnosis.
Right.
So, we mentioned that Harvey was experiencing these mood swings and that he was going through these periods of being very irritable, angry, starting fights with strangers. We discussed the possibility of him having what's called bipolar disorder, also known as manic depression. And we could almost characterize these episodes that he has as manic episodes, where he's going through severe mood swings to the degree that he's very irritable, starting fights. His ability to work has been kind of impacted. His relationships have been impacted, and that maybe his persona, his other persona, is a way that he's been able to kind of express his feelings of anger and hatred towards others, in this kind of different way that looks like dissociative identity disorder. It's not to say that he doesn't have that. There's still a possibility.
Right.
But DID is very rare. Research shows that it's probably the prevalence of DID is probably about 1%. When I say prevalence, I mean that's the proportion of the population that has that particular disorder or will have that particular disorder in their lifetime. Whereas bipolar disorder is much more common, a mental health problem, with between 4 and 4.5% of people experiencing that problem. So,
Gotcha.
Again, it's not to say that he has one or the other. He might actually have both. But bipolar disorder may have been the better explanation of those experiences.
When we left Harvey, he'd been in a horrible explosion, leaving him horrifically scarred on one side of his body.
Harvey! No.
Batman had taken him to the hospital, where he sees himself for the first time and then flees the hospital after his loving fiancée, Grace, sees him and faints. Good?
Right.
That brings us to 6 months later. Harvey is now a full-fledged crime boss, but he's not going after innocent people. He's specifically going after Rupert Thorne, the mobster who's responsible for not only his scarring, but also for his new, seemingly permanent identity as Two-Face.
Right.
And who's along with him?
The Ginger Twins.
Min and Max. The two gingers. I like to call them the Archie twins. They do look very Archie.
They look kind of like evil Archies.
3 freckles on each side of the nose, just like Archie. 11 episodes in, and it can't possibly be any more obvious that the writers absolutely loathe redheads.
Or it's possible that they really like redheads and want to put them as sort of the most kind of interesting.
Right.
Poison Ivy is.
Or maybe it's not even the writers. Maybe these are the animators. The animators hate redheads or love them as interesting villain characters.
Well, you know more about technical stuff than I do, but is it possible, given the color palette and and the animation, hues, like maybe that color shows better against these darker backgrounds.
We don't see very many blondes. Grace is a blonde, but we don't see too many people with yellow hair, and that I figure that would be just as popular, if not more so than throwing a redhead.
I'm just trying to throw you a bone here.
Well, I appreciate it.
I'm trying to blame it on the technology.
Yeah, so Two-Face enters one of Thorne's bookies' places, and they hold the place up, but only after Two-Face uses his trusty silver dollar to tell them to do so.
Right.
He's got one silver dollar. One side is clean. The other side has the three iconic, by this point, scratches along the back of it. He flips the coin to determine whether or not they're going to hit the place or not.
Good heads, we leave them alone. Bad heads, we hit them hard.
And of course, they end up going in and robbing the place. He seems to be unable to make any decisions without flipping this coin. Drea, as the professional here, what do you make of that?
Well, let's think about what he was like before he experienced his traumatic event.
Okay.
He didn't really have these. Would you say he didn't have these superstitious behaviors, right?
He didn't appear to, no. The coin flip was something we definitely saw during his therapy session. Like, he always associated the coin flip to Big Bad Harv. From the nightmare that we saw at the beginning of the episode to the coin flip that he took on as showing off Big Bad Harv in the therapy session. It's always sort of been his thing. But I don't think we've ever seen him in any kind of superstitious...
Yeah. I think it represents a lot of things. For one, he, as Two-Face, he has a different sense of morality. He has a different personality, right? Mm-hmm. He seems to rely on this superstitious behavior, this coin flipping, before making important decisions, as well as like really minor decisions. He surprised the Ginger twins when he flipped the coin before stealing some big... They're robbing the place, and they find the box of 200 silver dollars. He immediately tells them to take that. But then he flips the coin to determine if they're going to take other money, and the coin tells them not to. Right.
So they don't, and they're surprised by it.
Yeah, they're very confused by it. And it's because, his superstitiousness isn't logical.
Right.
It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not really based on reasoning. It's based on this very black and white thinking. And it's not unrealistic. It's certainly sometimes common for folks who have experienced events that are outside of their control to develop some kind of superstitious or kind of ritual that they engage in before making an important decision or before even just making very, very minor decisions, because it gives them the sense of control. So for Two-Face, the coin flip could represent that need for control, that this is going to help me determine to make every decision. On the one hand, he says, I'm leaving this up to fate, right? On the other, he's the one engaging in that act. He's the one flipping the coin.
Gotcha.
So there's this sense of wanting to take back control.
Right. Interesting. So like we said earlier, Two-Face is specifically targeting Thorne.
Right.
Over the last 6 months, he's gone after Club 22, Gemini Jewelers, Two's Company Cafe, all owned by Rupert Thorne, and, if you notice, all twos. Club 22, Gemini, twins, Two's Company Cafe. This is actually interesting because this was Two-Face's original shtick in the comics. His crimes would all be related to the number 2, just like this. So I think it's pretty cool that the writers of the show worked this in. What's weird, though, to me, is how Rupert Thorne also seems to be obsessed with the number 2, given that these are all his establishments.
Right, he owns all these places.
Yeah, I don't
maybe
know.
he was meant to be Two-Face.
In an alternate reality, maybe Rupert Thorne is Two-Face. He is obsessed with the number 2.
Well, maybe I would actually say, in the grand scheme of things, Rupert Thorne could possibly own like 90% of Gotham's... Well, that's not true, because Wayne Industries owns 90% of Gotham's... but maybe Rupert Thorne owns a lot of these nightclubs overall, and that the ones that have twos or associated with twos
Right.
is actually just a small percentage of his overall, ownership.
Maybe it's 2% of his
Oh,
ownership.
nice.
On the flip side, see what I did there?
I did.
On the flip side.
I heard.
Bruce is now having nightmares of his own. We started out the first episode
Yeah.
with Harvey having a nightmare about Big Bad Harv. And now Bruce is in the Batcave thinking about he's reliving the moment that Two-Face is blown up, or Harvey Dent is blown up.
Mm-hmm.
And then it even goes back to thoughts about his parents.
Why couldn't you save us, son?
He couldn't save Harvey. He couldn't save Thomas and Martha.
Right.
So clearly he blames himself for his old friend Harvey Dent's current state. Let's talk about Bruce's current condition a little bit.
Well, I think what they did with this scene is actually really cool because, as you said, there's a dream sequence in the first part of the Two-Face two-parter.
Right.
And in this one, the dream starts out with Harvey kind of in the dark in Gotham City. He's on a bridge. We almost get the sense that this is Harvey's dream,
right,
because he's at the center of the scene.
Yes. And
then Bruce shows up, and there's this actually really, really sad kind of exchange where Bruce is essentially feeling like he should have saved Harvey, and Harvey actually saying,
You saw what was happening? You knew something was terribly wrong with me? I thought you were my friend. You should have been able to help me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like you said, when Thomas and Martha show up, they are also saying, why couldn't you save your friend, Bruce? And then Bruce wakes up and you realize this is Bruce's dream.
Yeah.
This is his conceptualization of his failures and his inability to help, essentially to save his friend's life.
And then it gets a little creepy. Bruce starts in a weird sort of soliloquy.
So what are you dreaming tonight, Harvey? Peaceful dreams? Nightmares? Maybe both at once.
It's kind of weird.
It's so cool. I love that part.
It's
because
creepy.
he's not talking to anyone. He's just kind of talking out into the night in his bed.
It's creepy. It's creepy because it's the exact same voice that he uses when he says, Harvey, no. I've got to think that on the page that was more of an exclamation point, but
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a creepy moment for me.
I know. I like it. I think, again, this show is presumably for young adults and teens and children, and I think they really just wanted to exemplify that he felt, not only did he feel guilty and responsible, but he has this sense of hope for his friend.
Right.
And then at that moment, you get the sense that this is about two people that share something. That Bruce is essentially saying he understands what Harvey went through, and he has hope for his friend. And even later in the episode, he says,
I still feel that somewhere inside that monster is my old friend.
So there's this sense of him feeling like he shares this, there's this commonality between them, but also that it's up to him to help his friend, that he should be able to save him, and that despite all these terrible things Harvey's doing, there is still some good in him. And I think that's an important kind of message that we're hearing here.
Yeah.
Bruce hasn't given up on him. Remember, Bruce experienced hardships himself, and I think that he's pulling in from his own resiliency and feeling like, I am constantly saving myself. I'm constantly on the verge of going to the bad side, right? Because of the things that I know and the things that I've experienced. I've got to get Harvey to the same place.
As I like to do, I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Of course.
Is Bruce really interested in saving Harvey at this point, or is Bruce more upset with himself that he couldn't save Harvey? Like, this is all sort of, I don't know. It could be taken either way, that he's going after Harvey to save Harvey, his friend, or it's in order to complete his own mission, and thus making it more about Batman and more about Bruce Wayne than about Harvey.
Right, like good has to prevail.
Right.
And that's part of the mission. I think there's some truth to some of that. Yes, at some level, there is that sense of it is your responsibility to ensure the safety of the people that you love and to protect the people that you love.
Right.
And because of what happened to Harvey transforming into Two-Face, you failed at that. So yes, I do think there's this sense of Batman's failure.
Yeah, it's more about his failure, or maybe not more about his failure, but he's certainly feeling his own failure as much as he's feeling
Sure.
the loss of his friend.
But, you know, I still think there's this genuine sense of friendship and companionship between him and Harvey. And you have to think about what that means to Bruce. This is my best friend. This is the person that I related to. And I might even go so far as to say, like, this is the only real connection I've had.
Yeah, he doesn't have many friends.
Right. And
yeah.
and what happened to this person?
Yeah.
This is the kind of person that turned into a villain. So what does that say about me? If I can't help this person come back to being good-hearted and compassionate again, what does that say about me? Because we were very, very close. So it goes, I think, back to that symbolism of duality. You know, you have two people who one went to the dark side, if I can say, and one is still potentially on the good side. And, you know, how is he going to conceptualize this happening to his friend if he felt very aligned with him?
Interesting. So like you said, Bruce vows to save Harvey. Meanwhile, Candace, Thorne's right-hand woman, is disguised as a detective and convinces Dent's former love, Grace, to signal her should Harvey ever break down and contact her.
Mm-hmm.
We can certainly see where this is going, right?
Right.
Well, Harvey's totally after Thorne, and he makes a trip to Thorne's attorney, E. Doubleday, once again playing on the whole double thing. But he gets a file on Thorne that's pretty damning, in the same way that Thorne had the file on Big Bad Harv. Harvey now has a file, Two-Face now has a file on Thorne.
Money laundering, payoffs, blackmail. It's all here. I'll destroy Thorne with his file just like he destroyed me with mine.
Apparently, that's how you take people down in Gotham City.
Yeah, man.
Get their file.
Yeah. It's all in a manila folder.
You know it's unethical to steal people's files, right?
It's unethical to steal anything, from what I understand. Unfortunately, though, Batman has clearly figured out that Two-Face would be headed here, and he attempts to stop him, and appeals to the inner Harvey Dent by using Grace as a little bit of a trigger.
What about Grace?
Grace?
Which has a great impact on Two-Face. You can see him struggling with this idea.
Right. And again, just like they did with the first episode at the very end, in this episode, he'll turn, Harvey will turn his good face toward, whoever he's speaking with, if that's the sense that he's feeling. Maybe he's feeling compassion. Maybe he's feeling like he misses Grace. Maybe he's feeling that love. And so they'll just show that side of his face. And then when he becomes angry and vengeful again, they'll show his Two-Face face.
Right. Yeah, the directors are very good about this sort of reveal, the turning of the good face and the bad face. It's really nicely done. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't work. Batman's knocked unconscious, and he's awoken later by the janitor. So basically, Batman must not look very menacing or mythical to this guy who's sweeping the hallways. This guy's totally over it. If anybody ever brings up the Batman, he'll be like, hey, remember that time that I woke him up in the hallway with my mop? Batman's use of Grace has clearly gotten to Harvey, though, because he ends up calling her, and he tells her where she can find him. And she meets him at, once again, playing on the twos, the Wild Deuce 2 Casino. Take a shot, by the way. This could totally be a drinking game. If you pass any place in Gotham City whose name is something off the number 2, take a shot. Except you'd be dead within the 22 minutes of this episode.
It's a lot. It's a lot of shots.
That counts, by the way. 22 minutes.
What if you take 2 shots? Oh.
Oh, bad. Grace meets Two-Face, and eventually she nearly convinces him that she could.
What if you make it a double?
Oh,
Sorry.
That's what yeah, there we go.
How long did it take me to get from
If,
2 shots?
twice as long as it would anyone else.
Oh.
Like I said, Grace meets up with Two-Face, and she even nearly convinces him. I think that they could be together.
I love you.
Grace.
Here's the problem, though. She actually signaled to the person that she thought was a detective.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens? The Archie twins show up and fall forward, very Raiders of the Lost Ark style.
Well, the door opens and you see the Archie twins sort of just standing there. And then they flop forward because, I think...
Just like the guy at the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark, the guy who
Yes.
first betrays him, who's been hit by all the Jovitos poison darts, just falls straight forward.
Right.
Yeah.
But you get the sense, I kind of feel like is this the first time we've seen characters in BTAS, actually get killed?
I don't know. I don't know if they're...
They look like
They don't fight anymore. We don't see them anymore. They leave the frame and we're done with them. As far as I'm concerned, Gingers are dead. 2 of them, and they're the first 2 that we have seen die. We haven't even seen flashbacks of Thomas and Martha being shot.
Right.
We've only seen them post-death. The Gingers are killed in front of us.
Well, okay, let's go back to what the room is set up as, because I think it's kind of interesting. Two-Face actually describes why the room looks like it is when Grace enters it. You have one side which is very well lit, organized, neat, tidy, clean. The other side is, how would you describe that? It's dark, it's chaotic, it's menacing.
There's webs, and it's clearly not been used in a long...
Right.
It is the left side of his face.
Right, and he explains that this is very deliberate.
A dichotomy of order and chaos.
And that's how he sees his world. That's how he sees himself. That he's these 2 extreme people that, in a way, I know that we've talked about the Two-Face has taken over and he only has one personality. I don't think that's true. I think that he struggles with these feelings of anger and vengeance and hate, and he also struggles with feelings of compassion and wanting to help other people and wanting to have healthy relationships.
Right.
And he's kind of stuck between negotiating the 2, that he cannot reconcile those 2 very extreme feelings. And so he decides then, I'm going to live in both dichotomies. I'm going to live with these 2 extreme lifestyles. And, as we see, it doesn't work out too well for him.
Right. Yeah, because Thorne shows up, and the whole thing ends as any good Batman the Animated Series episode should, with a big brawl between Two-Face and Thorne's guys and Batman, and Batman eventually shows up, and eventually Two-Face is put into a position where he could kill Thorne.
Let the law handle it.
The law? Here's the only law. The law of averages. The great equalizer.
Batman uses the 200 silver dollars that they stole from the bookie earlier to confuse Dent. He throws them at him.
Makes it rain.
He confuses Dent. Dent can't find his coin, so he can't determine whether he should kill Thorne or not. By the way, this was used at the end of Batman Forever. This exact bit when we see Tommy Lee Jones flipping the coin.
I blocked that movie out of my mind.
Batman throws a bunch of them, and that's, Two-Face can't catch them. He's trying to figure out where his coin is. He falls to his death.
Even the coolest part of that movie, dare I say, was not original.
Was a rip-off of this episode.
We can certainly say now that as we've talked about, there are these pretty stable characteristics of particular villains and heroes. and
Yeah.
that with this one you have these expectations that there's a certain way that we expect Harvey Dent to behave, and I think that we find that consistency
Yeah.
here in the animated series.
So in the end, Harvey is carted off by folks, one of which appears to be in a hospital uniform. So I guess he's on his way to Arkham Asylum,
Yeah.
probably. Now, what's interesting to me is that now that Two-Face exists, no one really treats this like a case of dissociative identity disorder anymore. What I mean by that is when appealing to Harvey, neither Batman nor Grace, for that matter, ask to speak to Harvey the same way that the therapist did.
Right.
Or whatever. These two characters appear to be one and the same. So doesn't this lean toward Two-Face going back into the realm of the bipolar disorder, where he's no longer thought of as two separate characters? He is one guy who struggles with two different...
Well, possibly, but remember that in the first part, we were kind of seeing these episodes, we called them manic episodes because he was experiencing these mood states, these elevations in mood, where he was very irritable and angry and not like himself. People were saying, you're really not like yourself.
Right.
In the second part, we're not really seeing these vast mood swings, these ups and downs. We're just seeing this kind of, this constant. We are seeing, though, that he's still struggling between his, his Harvey Dent versus Two-Face emotional state. That Two-Face is violent and lacks empathy and is out for vengeance and will murder. Whereas Harvey is compassionate, cares about Grace, cares about Bruce Wayne. And I think that both of those sides are there.
Now, it's last episode you said that the therapy would actually try to get two identities to come together, to coexist. It seems to me that now that the anger has come out, now that Harvey is no longer bottling up this anger, Two-Face actually seems much more reasonable a person than Harvey ever did, or Big Bad Harv ever did. That now they are both living together. They are one person. One would even suggest that now that he's scarred and this villain, he's probably closer to, psychologically speaking, he's probably closer to a whole human again.
Right. Well, we said that, the objective of therapy would be to try to integrate those different parts of the self as much as possible to make a meaningful whole.
Right. And now he's kind of that meaningful whole. I mean, he struggles with both sides, but we all do.
We do, but not all of us experience this incredibly life-changing physical and emotional trauma. And I think that's where we have to look at the complexity of his experiences and his, kind of history. That he's essentially gone through this serious, life-threatening trauma, and that left him with emotional and physical scars. So, it's almost like we've potentially added a post-traumatic stress response to everything that we've just been talking about.
Which is perfect, because once Harvey is taken away to Arkham, what are those doctors going to do to this guy? I mean, between the trauma and the disorders, or potential disorders, how are they treating him?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first step would be a very thorough evaluation to understand how did that trauma impact him. So it almost becomes a very primary objective to understand the meaning of that traumatic experience, because I think, as we've talked about before on the show, that a trauma has potentially a number of different pathways that could follow. So somebody could experience a trauma and develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Someone could experience a trauma and develop depression. Someone could develop a substance abuse disorder.
Right.
Someone could actually grow from that experience and become quite resilient and turn their life around completely and become
Batman.
Right. Now you're saying Batman's healthy and resilient, whereas before
No, I'm saying you're saying Batman's. I see where
that
this
would
is
have been
leading.
where I would go, is
Right.
Batman, who
Right.
has experienced hardships and is able to, kind of transform that into a resilient process and be pro-social. So, and find meaning from that trauma. So we would want to understand what does that, I'm specifically talking about the explosion that was caused by Rupert Thorne. You have to look at the way that Harvey Dent would look at this. This
Right.
was not an accident. Somebody caused me a life-threatening, somebody caused this life-threatening event that could have killed me, but left me disfigured, ruined my relationship with my best friend and my fiance, and lost me the most important job in this town.
Right.
So all of that
And his mission. I mean, his
Right.
his mission in life was to clean up Gotham City, and now he can't. Now he can only be
Right.
one of the menaces of Gotham City.
Exactly. And so, I think people know this, but I want to draw people's attention toward the possibility that a physical trauma, that our body being physically changed, possibly being disfigured, and let's broaden this to like losing limbs, having brain injuries, having physical impairments, all those types of possible physical traumas, those indeed can cause psychological consequences and psychological conditions where people begin to develop very different behaviors and motivations.
Right. So let's talk about real cases of DID. Two of the most famous cases, of course, are those of Shirley Ardell Mason and Christine Costner Sizemore.
Now, is that one person?
It is two people take a shot. Mason was the woman who the public knows as Sybil.
Ah, Sybil.
Right. And Sizemore is the woman whose life was written into the book The Three Faces of Eve.
Mm-hmm.
Both, of course, were made into movies as well. Books and movies. So now it's interesting. Sybil is the case that's probably one of the most controversial because it's widely speculated that her psychiatrist, Dr. Wilbur, may have inadvertently created her 16 personalities through the uses of sodium pentothal and hypnosis. So basically, through heavy drugs and direct suggestion, this psychiatrist may have actually created her multiple personalities. That's sort of what a lot of people in your field think about this particular case. She actually went off afterward and had several years where she never had any symptoms of this disorder. So much so that when she died eventually of breast cancer, the people in her community found out that she was the Sybil and had no idea. They were completely shocked to find out that this was the person who supposedly had these 16 multiple personalities. Christine Costner Sizemore, on the other hand, was believed to have had as many as 20 different personalities. The book that was written about her life by her therapists, of course, suggested that her alters were basically fragmented from her real identity.
They're like different parts of her real
identity. based on traumas from early life, she created these alternate identities. However, since her identity was eventually released to the public, post-book, post-movie, she has written her own book, I Am Eve. And in fact, she's actually a very successful author now. But she insists that her personalities existed prior to her birth and are just as much a part of who she is as she is. Like she is convinced that these personalities all exist in one body, essentially.
Explain that. Prior to her, like these are all personalities of different people?
Yes. She is under the impression and I'm not going to say she's right or wrong, but she's under the impression that she has these personalities within her, not based on or not as a result of a trauma or some effect in her life that caused fractured identities. She was born with as many as 20 identities, and they just share the body,
I see.
essentially.
Okay.
Now, I'm not the professional. I just read stuff. What's interesting to me, though, is that this is a disorder that's basically, based on my research, it's kind of limited to North America, with only a few cases reported in Britain. None of the Eastern cultures, like China, India, Japan, have reported cases of these. It's pretty much solely a Western culture disorder. And what's even weirder is that prior to the publication of the book that made it famous, Sybil, there were only supposedly 200 cases of what would later become dissociative identity disorder in all of recorded medical history. It was after the publication, though, according to one article that I read, by the 90s, there were as many as 20,000 to 30,000 cases diagnosed. So it seems like it's kind of a fad. Like, once we find out about it, everybody's got it.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and I'm reluctant to agree with any mental health condition as being a fad. But
Right.
I understand what you're saying, that the same thing is happening right now with adult ADHD, whereas as we are able now to learn about the neurobiology and the neurochemistry of the brain and the impact and effectiveness of certain medications, we're finding that more and more adults are coming forward and saying they have ADHD.
Right.
Whereas decades ago, nobody was saying that, or fewer folks were saying that. So I understand what you're saying, which is as more information is made public and is as more research is exploring this condition, the prevalence of this particular problem goes up. And that's certainly a complex product of, actual neurobiology, culture, reduction of stigma around mental illness, as well as, unfortunately, I think the immediacy of wanting a diagnosis for unexplained symptoms, which I think, we're going back to Harvey Dent. If we see that first episode and we see that therapeutic exchange where he turns into Harvey Dent, immediately we're like, oh, he has multiple personalities, and we don't explore the possibility that he's in this acceptable cultural environment where he can now be the kind of angry bad self that he wants to be.
Right.
And so he's allowed himself to go there and to be this other person. I'm not saying he doesn't have DID, but I'm saying there's another explanation for that kind of multiple personality presentation. The interesting thing, DID is very debatable. I know I've read a couple of studies where, there'd be a number of people who have the diagnosis of DID, and they'll do these brain studies, they'll, put them on medication, they'll go through therapy. There's not a lot of these studies, but the ones I've read, interestingly, the majority, if not all of these patients have histories of childhood trauma. Interestingly, the majority of these patients, if not all of them, have a co-occurring other psychiatric problem. So it's not just DID, it's also bipolar disorder, it's also, some other major mental illness.
It's almost like DID isn't, and I realize it is in your manual of disorders, but it's almost like DID isn't necessarily a disorder as much as it is maybe a symptom of lots of disorders coming together.
That is probably the smartest thing you've said throughout this entire series.
Yay!
Because
it only took 11 episodes.
Here's why. Because, I said the majority, if not all of these patients experience childhood trauma. What happens to us when we experience a difficult hardship or trauma, especially in childhood? We develop this dissociative kind of response to it. So I want to be very clear. Dissociation is very real. People who have been assaulted, people who have been raped, people who have undergone, incredibly serious traumas will actually have this sort of like amnesia following that trauma. It could be a simple thing like not being able to understand parts of that trauma, parts of that traumatic experience, or it could be even more severe, like developing this inability to remember parts of one's life. Sorry. So it's very consistent then with that process that then on rare occasion somebody might develop these alter egos where there's no recollection at all about an entire personality, and we can look at that as an adaptive process. So does that mean they really truly don't have an understanding or cognitive awareness of the other alters? I don't know. Remember, essentially nothing is known about the neurobiology of DID, right? So there's no explanation for that, those multiple personalities. But
Right.
I think the best one is kind of what you said, that this may be, this dissociative process is a symptom of something else. And I think that's probably a really good explanation of why we have, very rare cases of people just presenting with all of these multiple personalities, and more so, what we often find are complex psychiatric presentations with these additional kind of dissociative experiences.
Gotcha. Cool. So, okay, it's time for questions from our listeners. As always, if you have questions for Drea, you can find us on Twitter. We are at ARKHAM Sessions on Twitter, and you can find us on Facebook. Look for the ARKHAM Sessions there. Follow us, like us, do all that, and then ask your questions. This week's question is from at Undoubtedly. He asks, do you think Harvey's bipolar condition was an intentional or conscious decision he made to cope with his scars?
I think so. I think that's probably a good explanation. And remember, his worldview is completely different now. Like before his trauma, he was struggling with his inability to control his anger and his need to really to protect the city, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then after his trauma, it's as if he experienced this shift in his worldview. And we can understand that, right? We've talked about how trauma can shift our core beliefs, our schema. And what his worldview is now is people will hurt you. People will take advantage of you. The world is unsafe unless you take control, unless you are the one flipping that coin and making the decisions and taking control. You are the one who's going to get hurt. And people are going to take things away from you, things that you love, like your friend, your job, and your fiance. So I feel like this is his way, Two-Face is his way of, just really taking that control. And I think it certainly does represent his worldview now.
Cool. Thank you, at Undoubtedly. Once again, you can find us on Twitter. We're at ARKHAM Sessions. And over on Facebook, we are the ARKHAM Sessions. So come find us and say hi and stuff. So that's it for me, Doc. You got anything you want to add?
There actually is something that I really liked about these two episodes. And I want to say this now because I know we're moving on to another villain, another story in the next episode of the animated series. So we're pretty much wrapping up Two-Face for now, and I know we'll return to him. But there are these moments where Bruce Wayne really shows his feelings of compassion and I even want to say like hopelessness about the situation with his friend. And there are times when the writers will show him wanting to reach out and to help him. And that's very realistic. That happens to a lot of us when a friend is experiencing some kind of hardship and maybe even a mental illness, and we're feeling very hopeless about the situation and we want them to get help. And so that part, again, the show really champions and validates the idea of receiving help for mental health problems. So I don't know if anyone felt the same way about the show and they're in that same spot, a family member, a friend, a colleague, is struggling and you want them to get help, I would recommend going to the website abct.org. It is the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, and that site provides a lot of resources for how to receive interventions, psychotherapy, and a lot of important literature about a lot of what we're talking about on the show. So that's a great place if if folks are feeling like they want more information and they'd like to share that information with somebody that they care about.
Where there's love, there's hope, Commissioner.
Okay, cool. So join us next week for our next episode involving a war between mob bosses. Guess who's back? Rupert Thorne. Yay!
I thought they got him.
They did, but apparently they don't keep him quite as long as they do Two-Face.
Oh.
This one's called It's Never Too Late, and that's on next week's docket of the ARKHAM Sessions. Till then, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at bward028. Drea, where can they find you?
At Arkham Asylum Doc on Twitter.
Perfect. So look for us there and join us next week. Till then, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Thanks for listening, gang.
Bye.
Welcome to the ARKHAM Sessions, everyone. As always, I'm Brian Ward, and I'm sitting next to Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hello.
So we're coming off the biggest week of the show ever.
It was.
Turns out Harvey Dent, pre-Two-Face, is a pretty interesting guy. But this week it's going to be pretty interesting as well. This is the very first episode where we're given Two-Face from beginning to end. And if you thought the psychological war between Harvey and Big Bad Harv was over, now that Dent's been disfigured, well... so let's get started, shall we?
We shall.
Okay, so last week, Harvey was struggling with his alter ego, Big Bad Harv. His therapist thought that this persona was created by Harvey's suppression of every angry feeling he's ever had since he was a kid. And it was somewhat determined by those within the show that due to his inability to remember his time as Big Bad Harv, Harvey was suffering from us, but he's not going after innocent people. He's specifically going after Rupert Thorne, the mobster who's responsible for not only his scarring, but also for his new seemingly permanent identity as Two-Face.
Right.
And who's along with him?
The Ginger Twins.
Min and Max. The two gingers. I like to call them the Archie twins. They do look very Archie.
They look kind of like evil Archies.
3 freckles on each side of the nose, just like Archie. 11 episodes in, and it can't possibly be any more obvious that the writers absolutely loathe redheads.
Or it's possible that they really like redheads and want to put them as sort of the most kind of interesting.
Right.
Poison Ivy is.
Or maybe it's not even the writers. Maybe these are the animators. The animators hate redheads or love them as interesting villain characters.
Well, you know more about technical stuff than I do, but is it possible, given the color palette and the animation, hues, like maybe that color shows better against these darker backgrounds?
We don't see very many blondes. Grace is a blonde, but we don't see too many people with yellow hair, and that I figure that would be just as popular, if not more so than, throwing a redhead.
I'm just trying to throw you a bone here.
Well, I appreciate it.
I'm trying to blame it on the technology.
Yeah, so, Two-Face enters one of Thorne's bookies' places, and they hold the place up, but only after Two-Face uses his trusty silver dollar to tell them to do so.
Right.
He's got a silver dollar. One side is clean. The other side has the three iconic, by this point, scratches along the back of it. He flips the coin to determine whether or not they're going to hit the place or not.
Good hits, we leave them alone. Bad hits, we hit them hard.
And of course, they end up going in and robbing the place. He seems to be unable to make any decisions without flipping this coin. Drea, as the professional here, what do you make of that?
Well, let's think about what he was like before he experienced his traumatic event.
Okay.
He didn't really have these. Would you say he didn't have these superstitious behaviors, right?
He didn't appear to. No.
He's-
I mean, the coin flip was something we definitely saw during his therapy session. Like he always associated the coin flip to Big Bad Harv, from the nightmare that we saw at the beginning of the episode to the coin flip that he took on as showing off Big Bad Harv in the therapy session. It's always sort of been his thing, but I don't think we've ever seen him in any kind of superstitious.
Yeah. You know, I think it represents a lot of things to kind of express his feelings of anger and hatred towards others, you know, in this kind of different way that looks like dissociative identity disorder. It's not to say that he doesn't have that. There's still a possibility.
Right.
But DID is very rare. Research shows that it's probably the prevalence of DID is probably about 1%. When I say prevalence, I mean that's the proportion of the population that has that particular disorder or will have that particular disorder in their lifetime. Whereas bipolar disorder is much more common, a mental health problem with between 4 and 4.5% of people experiencing that problem. So,
Gotcha.
you know, again, it's not to say that he has one or the other. He might actually have both, but bipolar disorder may have been the better explanation of those experiences.
When we left Harvey, he'd been in a horrible explosion, leaving him horrifically scarred on one side of his body.
Harvey. No.
Batman had taken him to the hospital, where he sees himself for the first time and then flees the hospital after his loving fiancée, Grace, sees him and faints. Good?
Right.
That brings us to 6 months later. Harvey is now a full-fledged crime boss, multiple personality disorder, or as it's called now, dissociative identity disorder.
Right, DID.
Drea, you thought there was an alternative diagnosis, though. Something about horses and minotaurs.
Right. Well, I use the phrase that we often use in this field, which is when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. And it's not to say that zebras don't exist. They certainly do. But sometimes when we hear certain characteristics and symptoms, we immediately go to the most kind of interesting, exotic representation, and we forget about what might be the most common and certainly well-explained scenario or diagnosis.
Right.
So, you know, we mentioned that Harvey was experiencing these mood swings and that he was going through these periods of being very irritable, angry, starting fights with strangers. We discussed the possibility of him having what's called bipolar disorder, also known as manic depression. And we could almost characterize these episodes that he has as manic episodes, where he's going through severe mood swings to the degree that he's very irritable, starting fights. His ability to work has been kind of impacted. His relationships have been impacted. And that maybe his persona, his other persona, is a way that he's been able